Good morning, everyone. And so much a blessing to see you. I'm grateful. I don't know how much when you come and you walk out those doors, you feel empowered or encouraged in your Christian walk. I know I do a lot of the teaching that's here, so most of the things that are being taught aren't a surprise to me by the time I walked out the door. If they were, we'd have a real problem, I suppose. But I want you to know that even though there's not a novelty for me in what I'm learning or thinking about, I always walk out of here really encouraged because of you, because of being with you. And I'm just so grateful to see your faces and to worship together. And also to dedicate our time this morning, again, to this conversation about fasting. This is our third week out of 6 in which we're talking about reclaiming biblical fasting. The first week, what we did is we looked at Matthew chapter 6 and the 3 Christian disciples or disciplines that Jesus encourages. And what we notice is that Jesus expects his disciples to fast. But I knew that if I just gave that one lesson, that there would be all kinds of questions like, what now? How do I do that? What does that even look like? And so I realized that there had to be more. So last week what we talked about was the 7 reasons for fasting. That is the 7 motivations for beginning a fast. And that there's a lot of benefit, therefore, to be derived from fasting. Well, today is about how to fast. And I'm glad that that is our lesson for today. I went to go visit Ricky. And Ricky, when I saw him on Wednesday, was just in a spiritual hole. I mean, he's just struggling because he's laid up in bed and he's hurting or unable to move, and that's very hard for him. And he said, tell me about this series on fasting. I really want to know, and it would be a great conversation for me to have right now. I said, Ricky, there's nothing about you that needs to be fasting. You need to be learning how to eat. He said, that's fair, but please tell me about it anyway. I said, okay. And so I walked him through the first 2 lessons, and I said, do you have any questions you'd just love to ask me about fasting? And his first question was, how long? How long should a fast be? And I went, what a fantastic question, Ricky. He said, in my mind, every fast has to be for 3 days. And I was like, oh. Well, let me tell you that there is a range of application for fasting. And when I answer the question today, how to fast, I'm going to give you what that range looks like. In fact, let me give you some examples of biblical fasting and what they fasted as just a first illustration. So we can talk about Jesus. And Jesus began his ministry fasting. Does anyone remember how long he fasted? 40 days, yeah, thank you for mouthing that to me, absolutely. But what did he fast? All food, such that at the end he was hungry. Okay, that's one version of fasting. Well, let me give you another. Daniel, when he fasted, both in Daniel chapter 1 and Daniel chapter 10, he fasted so that he was eating vegetables for every meal. So technically his fast was just putting away selective things, but he was constantly eating. All right? Well, what about Esther? Esther went even more extreme than Jesus did. For 3 days in preparation to go before the king, she fasted food and water and encouraged all Israel to do the same. That's not what Jesus did. Jesus would not have fasted water for 40 days. He fasted just food, but she fasted food and water. All right. Well, what about the Nazarites? We're going to include our Nazarites in the lesson for today, but I want to tell you that they went for extended periods of time while giving up simply wine and grape products, where they just put away one special thing. And then we could talk about couples who in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, they fasted intimacy. In case you are curious about that, I'll go ahead and read that for you. This is 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And beginning in verse 1, it says, now concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is good for a man to not have sexual relations with a woman. That's his quote. It says, but because of temptation to sexual immorality, each one should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For if the wife does not have authority over his own body, but the husband does, and likewise the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does, do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer, and then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. When they fasted, this wasn't even a food fast. They gave up intimacy for a period of time. When it comes to what they fasted, even within these 5 examples, there's a great diversity in what a fast can include. So here's what I want to share with you today. 1, we're just answering the question, how to fast. That is what we're going to talk about today. And there are 2 models for it. 2 models for how to fast. And here's what they are. The 2 models for fasting are food and non-food. You might think those are the most general categories there could ever be. Of course, there's a food and a non-food. But those are the 2 models for fasting, and I want to share with you today. So we'll go through what it looks like to fast food, and then we'll go through what it looks like to fast non-food. And I'm going to tell you for each one how to get started. If you are interested in beginning a fast, how do you get started? So let's start with food first. Go with me to Matthew chapter 6, verses 16 through 18. Matthew chapter 6, verse 16 through 18. If you're following along in the Blue Bible, that's going to be on page 473. 473. Now, before we get into this text, I do want to tell you that even with regard to food, there is a range of applications. You should have seen that in what we just noted from the fasting examples that we just had. Let me give you the 3 applications, the 3 levels, if you will, of fasting. Food fasting. There is the complete fast in which you have nothing. No food and no water. You should notice that this is what Esther did when she was preparing to go see the king and was concerned about the people. She had no food and no water. You might also notice that Paul does that in Acts chapter 9, after he has gone on the Damascus road, that he arrives in the city and it says he took neither food nor water for 3 days. Okay, that's one. But then what I would call is the normal fast is no food and water only. You cannot do no food and no water for any long period of time. In fact, in one of the biological books that I read about fasting, basically it said, you can do that, but ask a doctor first and don't go very long, because you could get into serious trouble if you did. This can extend for longer periods of time in which you have water only. I was talking to a guy in my little scouting group. Noah and I went camping on Friday night, and one of them, knowing that I was a preacher, said, by the way, what are you preaching about on Sunday? He probably thought a Mother's Day sermon. Not today, I guess. But I said, we're talking about fasting. And I said, when was the last time your church talked about fasting? He said, well, we talk about it about every year or 2. I was like, oh, okay, cool. He said, yeah, the leadership team at our church, we, for twice a year for a long time, would go on 3-week fasts of water only. And I went, whoa. He said, yeah, actually, let me give you the breakdown about how that works. He said, to fast water only, he said, on day 3 is the hardest day, and then you're going to be fine until about the 7th day. And then once you get to the 7th day, you'll be hungry a little bit, but it'll settle down, and then you'll feel really good until about day 14. And I was like, okay. I'm walking through how possible all this stuff is, because it's surprising to me if it's surprising to you. He said, but let me give you a warning. He said, your body's going to start detoxing some stuff over the course of this, and so you're going to start smelling really bad, and your breath is going to be awful, because your body's just going to start like leaking all the toxins that you've had stored up. And I went, oh, good to know. But for most, what I call the normal fast, for most of Scripture, they would fast water only for 24 hours. Now, I'm not encouraging that as a standard. I'm saying that's what would be traditional according to Scripture. But then there is the partial fast, and you get this in Daniel's example, in which he decided that he was just going to eat vegetables. And that was what he decided as his food fast, is that he would eat vegetables, and he did so for 3 weeks. But what I wanted to show you, therefore, as it even comes to food fast, is that there's a range for application, a range of intensity, if you will, which can be modified for every person who wants to participate. All right. But now let me show you in Matthew chapter 6, beginning in verse 16, what Jesus says about fasting. It says, and when you fast, do not look gloomy like the hypocrites, for they disfigure their faces, that their fasting may be seen by others. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, that your fasting may not be seen by others, but your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. I just wanted to note to you a few things from this verse about what I would call a day in the life of fasting. And you notice that the hypocrites, when they fast, they disfigure their faces. Kids, Brenton, Sam, Coleman, James, like, what do you think is the face that you'd make for the hungriest you've ever been? Go ahead, show me your face. Thank you, Brenton. Would it look like this? Oh. Well, the picture that you get of the hypocrites was that anytime they fasted, they put on that face. They wanted to look as miserable as possible because they were hungry, and they wanted everyone to know that they were hungry. But what that tells us, by the way, even though they exaggerated because they wanted to let everyone know that they were fasting, they were trying to put that on display, is that over the course of any kind of fast, you're going to feel hungry. If you're fasting food, even if you choose that in your fasting, you're going to fast to eat vegetables for whatever meal that you would include, at various points you're going to feel hungry. And being hungry itself is not a spiritually dangerous thing. In fact, it can be very valuable, because we're going to talk about this next week when we talk about Deuteronomy chapter 8. We're going to talk about the fact that that hunger can focus your attention and actually be a good thing for relying on God. We'll talk about that more next week. But here's what I have noticed in the fasting that I've done. Now, in fasting, I've only done water fast for 24 hours a day, and at most 3 of them per week. I am not encouraging anyone to engage in that practice. I'm just trying to tell you where my experience is coming from so far. And what I've noticed even about the hunger is that it comes in waves. If you're busy throughout the day, and you come to a moment where you're hungry, and you can kind of keep going, and if you keep going, then eventually that hunger will subside. Now, I said that to Samantha, by the way, and she said, lies. So I realize there's also a range of experience for that one too. But there is an element in which we can expect that if we're fasting food to whatever degree we are able, that will be part of it. But also, it says when you fast. And here's what I wanted to note from that. That word for when is kind of interesting. It is hatan, that is literally whenever. also shows that the period in which you dedicate to fasting can vary wildly. You can choose something as small as one meal. You can choose something as large as the guy who went for 3 weeks and was leaking toxins that were in his body. You can do that, I suppose. But with that, you get to determine how long that is. And that's a beautiful thing. Because when we understand that, it allows us to apply a spiritual discipline to whatever our limitations are. And by the way, I realize that when it comes to health concerns, there's some people who should not fast. Like I told Ricky as he's like, oh, that's interesting. I said, Ricky, you need to be learning to eat food, solid food again. This is not appropriate for you. And there may be, and if you need to consult your doctors, that is an okay thing to do. But we can apply this method or these strategies at whatever our limitations are. And I'm not trying to force or encourage anything beyond that. All right. Last thing I want to note to you from this is, he says, when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face. What does that matter? Except that he's encouraging them to just carry on with daily living. Do the things that you'd normally do, act the way you'd normally act, and proceed on as usual. These I find helpful when answering the question, how to get started. If ever you wanted to begin a fast and you wanted it to be a food fast, here are the 4 things that you have to decide. First, what level are you going to do? Complete, normal, or partial? Are you just going to set aside some particular foods? Are you going to set aside all food? Are you going to set aside food and water? That's your first question. The second question is determine the time. Okay, I'm going to set aside and only eat vegetables for lunch. Like, you can decide something as low as 1 meal. That would be okay. But you can determine the time, but pick a determined time. And then third, keep your normal schedule. Whatever you would be doing normally, continue in normal activity. And then finally, end with gratitude. I'll add that to say that if ever you end a fast, or whenever you end a fast, there is a beauty to saying, thank you, God, for that meal. I asked that friend, I said, okay, so you fasted for 3 weeks, and then what did you eat? He said, I shouldn't have done this, but I got a Panera bread bowl with soup. He said, oh man, it hurt, but I loved it. And I just had to ask him, I said, brother, what did it taste like? And he said, it was the best thing I've ever tasted, because there was a level of gratitude to his meal, to coming back after fasting. And so I simply say, end with gratitude. So, how to get started? Choose your level, choose your time, continue on as normal, end with gratitude. If you want to start a food fast, that's how. But there's 2 models for fasting. And now I want to share with you a model for non-food fasting. And originally, this was going to be the entire sermon. But I decided to expand it to go ahead and include that picture for food fasting as well. But go ahead and open with me to Numbers chapter 6. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, which is going to be on page 65 if you're following along, is the vow of the Nazarites. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. But I want to show you what the Nazarite vow was and why I think it's so valuable as a model for non-food fasting. First, concerning the Nazarite vow, I want you to read verse 1 and 2 with me. It says, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when either a man or a woman makes a special vow, the vow of a Nazarite, to separate himself to the Lord. The first thing that I wanted to note about this Nazarite vow was that anyone could. He makes very specific, man or woman, doesn't matter. It is also, the picture that you get of the Nazarite vow is that it was for any person who was not a priest. This was as close as a priest could get to being a priest without actually being one. And so this was open to anyone who could take this vow. And I'll add, by the way, Paul undergoes a Nazarite vow, very likely as he's returning to Jerusalem the last time. Because he's been warned that people are worried that he's speaking against Moses and the law, and they advise him, undergo a vow with these men who are already doing so, and when you get to Jerusalem, pay to have their hair cut. That's part of the vow, is you cut your hair at the end. So even Paul probably participated in a Nazarite vow as a Christian. Kind of cool. Anyway, so anyone could. The next thing I wanted to point out to you is that what they technically did in their fast is abstain from wine. Look at verse 3 with me. It says, he shall separate himself from wine and strong drink. He shall drink no vinegar made from wine or strong drink, and shall not drink any juice of grapes or eat any grapes fresh or dried. Sorry, no raisins. So all grape products and all wine, therefore, is what they abstain from. Now, I do find that interesting. By that logic, I have been on a Nazarite vow for my entire life. I don't drink. I've never made a practice of drinking, kind of thing. When I broke that Nazarite vow, if you will, as far as my whole life is concerned, was actually in church. Because in Rome, they actually drink wine with their communion. And I told Samantha that beforehand. I said, by the way, it's real wine when you go to the communion. She said, okay. So when she got it, she just took the smallest bit. And I took it, and I do it like I normally do. Knocked the thing back. And all of a sudden I looked at Samantha and said, because I didn't expect it. Well, I forgot what to expect anyway. But why I find it interesting, though, is because for them, setting aside this wine was something special, was something that they dedicated to. But wine is not a life necessity. In fact, it was almost a luxury. And that's what they were putting aside. They were putting aside something non-essential, but was something pleasurable to them. All right, third is that the period of time was determined by the worshiper. Look at verse 5 with me. All the days of his vow of separation, no razor shall touch his head until the time is complete for which he separates himself to the Lord. He shall be holy. He shall let the locks of hair of his head grow long. How often do you need a haircut? I need one right now. But how long is it until it's even noticeable that you need one? Is kind of the question. Well, their fasts for the Nazarite vow were longer than that. In fact, there are pictures, by the way, of Jews who are participating in a Nazarite vow, and they've come to some pretty cool hairstyles that associate with it. They let their hair grow long, and then they just do it in large ringlets that go down and down and down. Because some undergo Nazarite vows for very long times. But the period is determined by the worshiper to commit to a particular set of time. I don't think that Paul, on his way to Jerusalem, was participating in this fast for an incredibly long time. It could have been very short. But nonetheless, you see in verse 5 that it is a kind of whenever, and it is determined by the worshiper. Next, they didn't cut their hair. And why I note this is to say that they had a way for marking the time. They had a way for noticing that the time was elapsing that they had participated in this. I'll just leave it there for now. And then I want you to read verse 8 with me, which says, all the days of his separation he is holy to the Lord. Again, the whole point in this was growing in holiness, was in dedicatedness to God. And then finally, this I find really fascinating, and that is, if you break the fast, you restart. Here's what it says, verses 9 through 12. If any may, because of their fast, it says in verse 6, all the days of his separation, or that he separates himself to the Lord, he shall not go near a dead body, nor even his father or not even for his father or for his mother, for brother or sister. If they die, shall he make himself unclean, because his separation to God is on his head. And all the days of his separation he is holy to the Lord. So he says, don't go near any dead bodies. It says in verse 9, if any man dies very suddenly beside him, and he defiles his consecrated head, he shall shave his head on the day of his cleansing, and on the 7th day he shall shave it. And on the 8th day he shall bring 2 turtle doves and 2 pigeons to the priest to the entrance of the tent of meeting, and the priest shall offer for one sin offering, and the other for a burnt offering, and make atonement for him because he sinned by reason of a dead body. He shall consecrate his head that same day, and separate himself to the Lord for the days of his separation, and bring a male lamb a year old for a guilt offering. But the previous period shall be void because his separation was defiled. Basically what he just explained was, if you accidentally touch a dead body in this, you start over. You shave your head and you start over. By the way, can you imagine what that situation in verse 9 would look like? If any man dies very suddenly beside him? Ever happened to you? Richard, don't answer that question. No, it probably didn't happen very often, but they did consider that contingency, and what they said was essentially, if you have to break the fast, start it over. Here's why I think this is a great model for non-food fasting. How to get started. First, choose a non-essential. You can fast anything. You can put aside something for any period of time as a matter of fasting. I was grateful that Richard, when he was talking this morning, by the way, there's a sermon coming up on Isaiah 55, or Isaiah 58, the passage that you read. Fantastic. Great insights on that. But he was saying, I need to apply this to my finances, and maybe I need to set aside some of my practices in that. I thought that was kind of cool. But you can choose something non-essential. I read a lot of books in preparation for this series, and some of them made great examples of choosing a non-essential. Let me give you 3. 2 of them were by Wendy Speak, and one of them was by Jen Hatmaker. These were all ladies, and by the way, all of these books were almost written as fasting diaries. So they'd tell you what they were doing along the way. One of them was called the 40-Day Social Media Fast, where they put aside Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, whatever your social media... Did I say Twitter? X? Whatever that thing is. They would put aside the social media for, in this, 40 days. Another by Wendy Speak was the 40-Day Sugar Fast, where she put aside any refined sugar. And again, even those who were participating with her did so at various levels. But then there was Jen Hatmaker, and the book is called 7. And in that book, she went through 7 fasts that lasted a month each. One in which she put aside, she only wore like 7 items of clothing. Another one in which she only ate 7 foods. So like 7 ingredients, one of which was like whole wheat bread, one of them which was like avocado, and she had 7 staples that were part of her diet. She put aside to give away 7 items every day for a month. She, and all of these things, she just kept her diary along the way. And I thought that was kind of interesting. But what this opened me up to was the fact that even this fasting non-essentials, you can choose a lot of things. And you might wonder, well, how do you make that choice? To this logic, I would probably apply the logic of the rich man who came up to Jesus, the rich young ruler. When he came up to Jesus and he said, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus said, "You know the commandments." And finally, Jesus said, "But one thing you lack, go sell everything that you have and give it to the poor. And come follow me and you will have treasure in heaven." And the man was just crushed. It was the one thing he couldn't give up. If you're looking for the one non-essential to fast, try to find, maybe you should start with the one thing you feel like you could never give up. Maybe that could be your social media. Maybe that could be Maybe that could be your shopping habits. Maybe that could be the news program that you keep running every morning. But if you find the one thing that you don't feel like you can give up, but you know it's a non-essential, maybe that's the thing that you can target. But choose a non-essential. Then set an end date. Say, okay, I'm going to start on this day, and I'm going to get to the end. I'll tell you, by the way, I did not take that first step in my first fast this year. I just said, I'm just going to go. Do you know how long it lasts when you don't have an end date? Eventually it feels interminable. It feels like it's never going to end. Set an end date. So that way you're not just like, okay, I'm just going. So I would encourage you, by the example of the Nazarites, set an end date. Then mark the time. You can mark your calendar. You can, by the way, my first one, following the Nazarites, I knew I would never get away with it if I didn't cut my hair. Eventually you'd all go, Josh, you need a haircut. It would happen, I know. Samantha most especially. So if you didn't notice, I grew my beard for the first one. And I didn't shave it. And some of you were like, your beard's getting a little scraggly. And I didn't explain. But it was just a way for me to mark the time. You don't have to do anything like that. And in fact, I was trying to fly under the radar mostly. But you can find a way to just say, okay, the time is passing. And find a way to mark the time. And then lastly, start over if needed. I find that clause really valuable. Do you know why? Because if you're on a 20-day fast for social media and you get to the 18th day and you're like, but I really just want to scroll through YouTube. If you have a start over clause, you know, okay, you can watch YouTube this once, but then you're going to go another 20 days before you get to watch it again. Start over clauses are really valuable when it comes to non-food fasting. So I would encourage you, if you want to get started on something like this, choose a non-essential, set an end date, mark the time, and start over if needed. And these are essentially the two models for fasting, food and non-food. And what I hope to have communicated over the course of this is applications vary. And if you want to participate, there are lots of different levels, lots of different matters of time, and lots of different applications for participating in this. And therefore, I really encourage, if you want to get started, here's how. So far in this series, we have talked about the fact that Jesus expects his disciples to fast. There's 7 great reasons for fasting. Now, how to fast. Here's going to be our next ones. Deuteronomy chapter 8 is... man shall not live by bread alone. It is about connecting our fasts to Scripture. And that's what Jesus also quotes in Matthew chapter 4. And then we're going to go to Isaiah chapter 58, in which the lesson is called Not So Fast, how not to fast. And then we're going to talk about when you feast, because there is a beauty to ending fasting and rejoicing in what the Lord provides. So that's going to be the rest of our series. But thank you for looking at this topic with me today.